So, guys, they just announced that Blood and Guts is November 22nd. No, November 12th, which is close to Veterans Day. And I have a bunch of up and down feelings about this. And I do want to talk about, why I think mostly this is a really, really stupid idea to have Blood and Guts, on a television show. And then also just to have it in Greensboro, North Carolina. That, the first thing that I'm going to say is that ultimately, what about Wrestle Dream? That, you should have done one of two things. You should have said, okay, we're doing Wrestle Dream in Greensboro, and we should have Blood and Guts there, really. Like, I just do not like this thing about how with Blood and Guts, it's not a pay-per-view match. It makes a lot of sense to put it on a pay-per-view. And it does two things. That number one, you have matches like 45 minutes, and then to an hour really, so it allows you to have less matches and experiment with less matches, or you feel like there's no build or a lot of people are out like Swerve and Osprey, and then also Takeshita maybe leaving for a while. There is a sense of, okay, well, why not, with Wrestle Dream have like maybe 8 matches and a Blood and Guts match. So wouldn't it make sense to kind of make your pay-per-views pop more by having like these matches, and then also having a pay-per-view where you're allowed to be a lot more violent than television and other things like that. So, and then the other thing too with AEW is that, with pay-per-view attendance and pay-per-view buys, they always have to be strong. I know that usually they get 100,000 people or a little bit more with pay-per-views. That's good, but definitely the attendance has always been like, fluctuated. And last I checked, they've had 4,000 people at the Chief Fitz Arena, like close to 4,000 people as of right now, really. And that's not good, really. So imagine if you had Blood and Guts at Wrestle Dream. Imagine how much more would that show would pop, really, because they don't really have that much build, really. So it's ultimately, like one of two things. Number one, they should have just said, we're not going to do it anywhere but in St. Louis, our next pay-per-view. Or they should have said something like, well, we want to do this match. It should be at a pay-per-view, so we're not going to do the St. Louis show. We're going to do it in Greensboro at that arena, and we're actually going to, or even like the arena that Sting retired at, and then we're going to actually just, have the match then and there, really. So you would have gotten a lot more. You've got it in a more populous city, in a city that respects and has a tradition of professional wrestling, and then you could have also done something like that as well, really, where you could have had this pay-per-view level match at a pay-per-view show, or you can even done something like say, hey, you know what, we're in Florida for the next 4 weeks. Maybe we should have Wrestle Dream in Florida, and maybe we should have had this match at Daly's Place or another arena where, we could have gotten a decent amount of people, really. So the fact that this is not a pay-per-view match and this is a pay-per-view draw type of match, really, it's really just, stupid. Well, as I said before, and I'll say it again, if you had every Hell in a Cell match on Monday Night Raw, it would be stupid because there's so many things that you could do if you put it on a pay-per-view. The next thing that's a big concern about this is that they got a big arena for this. I think, the arena that they're going to in Greensboro is around 20,000 people. It's like close, I think around 24,000 people. So it's almost like, and the max capacity has gone up to 26,000. So, so it's almost like a test, really. Like every, if I'm doing my Scott Steiner math correctly, every 1,000 people is like a 4%, really. So technically, they have to get like maybe like a little bit over 20,000 for this to kind of be, very profitable. But more than likely, they're probably going to hit maybe between, low as like 3,000 or 4,000 all the way up to maybe 12,000 or something like that, really. Like this has to be a banger. This has to be a sellout, really. And I do understand there's a lot of people pissed with WWE going to Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of people pissed with WWE, buying out people, raising the pricing out people and other things like that. So there is such a sense of, this could pop, really. And then also WWE is TV PG. This is TV 14, really. So there's a huge sense of how this would appeal to people. But ultimately, you have to think to yourself, okay, well, the Blood and Guts show, if this was a pay-per-view, there's a lot more opportunities for you to make pay-per-view level matches, really, because ultimately there's two things that they can do. They can have a men's blood and guts and a women's blood and guts on the same show. I think that's a very bad idea because it becomes repetitive. It's like having two Hell in a Cell matches or two Royal Rumbles, one for the ladies, one for the men's, really. So there's a diminishing return. And then also, too, that, one thing I've not liked about AEW is when they have blood and guts, what they'll always do is they'll say, okay, now we have two rings. We're going to do a Royal Rumble type of thing, really, where the winner gets a title shot. Like, it's just like, a little dumb in a way. It just is a dumb visual. But what I would say is that, if this was on a pay-per-view and you had other matches like Takeshita versus Okada, Hangman versus MJF, Darby versus Moxley, I Quit, you could have like a women's tag team tournament final match. You could have like, Chris Statlander versus Marina Shafir, or Chris Statlander, versus somebody else, really. Or you could have done something like Athena, versus somebody else, or somebody else versus somebody else, really. Or Mercedes does an open challenge and then she faces Bozilla or another wrestler who's not in the match and says, you know what, I want to shine, I was overlooked, or even Nyla Rose. You could have built a good pay-per-view card, and then this is ultimately just, your card's like the lobster, and then this is ultimately the steak. So you have the surf and turf, So, it's ultimately, as I said before, and I'll say it again, really, that, if you kind of had all these matches on a pay-per-view, it would draw more than just a television show where you can only have maybe 3 or 4 matches, or you may just say, hey, we're going to do 2 of these, and there's a diminishing return. So, it's going to be very, challenging for AEW, which has a pattern of not the best ticket sales, to actually draw a crowd, really, for this. The other problem with this is Full Gear. This is a bad match because this is a week before Full Gear. This is maybe 10 days, 10 or 9 days, really. So you're going to have a show in Greensboro that's almost like a pseudo pay-per-view, your blood and guts. And then a week later, you're going to have your Newark, New Jersey show. And the Newark, New Jersey Full Gear, they usually draw very well in New Jersey, the tri-state area. The other thing, too, is that it's almost like, they may do something, they may put so much attention on blood and guts. It's almost like maybe a week after, or maybe during blood and guts, they're going to announce a lot of matches for the next upcoming pay-per-view. But it's ultimately, as I said, it's almost like, having a Christmas Eve dinner and not knowing what you're going to do for the Christmas Day dinner. And the Christmas Day dinner turns out to be a little shitty and stuff like that. So that's also a big detriment. That's one of the issues with AEW, is that they're nefarious with so many special shows in a row, or so many special shows before a pay-per-view. So this kind of repeats this pattern, really. And I think the other, big issue as well is that it does hurt the women's division in a lot of ways, because ultimately, imagine if this was on a pay-per-view and you had okay, we're going to interview all these 10 women. You're going to see maybe 1 or 2 promos, video packages, after every match. And then this becomes the main event, or the penultimate match. Or if you open with Hangman and MJF and you end with the women's blood and guts to do something more different and stuff like that, I think that you would have kind of gotten something. And then ultimately, too, it's how are you really going to build these women? How are you going to treat them like a big deal? Because really the biggest thing you need to get out of this blood and guts match is how are you going to treat your women's wrestlers? What are you going to do with these 10 ladies? Are you going to do a Ring of Honor? Are you going to do a Royal Rumble thing? Or are you going to do a Money in the Bank thing? Or are you going to do Elimination Chamber thing where you're going to say, hey, these are the 10 women we're going to focus on. We're going to nerf Tony Storm and Mercedes, and Athena, so these women are more powerful, or we're going to actually elevate these women so they're on their level, because now we have 10 women that can do shit instead of just these 3 other women, because Mercedes has run its course. Athena, there's a lot of people who think Athena is dead, really, because she's not that well advertised. But someone's been a champion for about 3 years. It means you don't know how to find the next in line, really. And then the other part of it is as I said, with Mercedes and Tony Storm, they've run their courses. They've been champions for a long time. The Sunset Boulevard gimmick is a little too old, and the champion gimmick is a little too old. Really, you're flanderizing. You're going in repeat mode. So ultimately, as I said, if you put this on pay-per-view, we have a pay-per-view that we remember from first Women's Blood and Guts. It seems like that's a better call for it. And I also just want to talk about the strengths. I think the strength is people like Blood and Guts, so it does boost the rating. The next thing that I will say is ultimately special shows are okay, and I think with AEW they've been doing a great job with special shows this year, where they've worked really hard not to do it all the time. Because I remember they had 3 or 4 between September and October last year, so now it's the anniversary show, and then they don't have any more like special television programming until Blood and Guts in November, and that's what they should do, because you can't do something like back-to-back weekly special shows really. So I appreciate that they're diminishing it. The other thing that I will say is you never know about Full Gear, because there could be a rematch between the women without titles. You could do something, and I advise this: have Mercedes, have Athena, and have like Chris Statlander or whoever the women's champion is at that time. And then you do something like say, hey, they're actually watching the match, they're watching these women perform, and then Mercedes says something like, hey, you know what, I see Tekla, or I see, Willow, really giving her all, really, and even though it's all about me, even though it's all about me, I'll make it about me beating her at Full Gear. Oh, well, yeah, Chris Statlander, she looks at another woman like Tekla or somebody else during the match, or Jamie Hayter, and says, hey, you know what, we're going to have a match. I get first picks of who I want to face based on performance, or based on, or even said something like the winner of the match, or whoever causes the win for their team faces, Statlander for the women's championship. And then also Athena, she gets like third pick, and she's kind of like saying, hey, you know what, I see Tekla, I see Jamie Hayter, I see Willow Nightingale, I see Thunder Rosa, I see Nyla Rose. There's something to this. There's something to this bitch. We're going to have a match at Death Before Dishonor. And then you take it from there, really. Because that's been the big issue with AEW. It's called either epilogues and tie-ins, which is what do you do after this? And as I said, the easiest thing for them to do is set a path for these women, going forward, really. Or even if you want to do something like, you have maybe 5 women on each team, and 2 of them are tag team partners. So imagine if, you had the women's tag team tournament, and you end it at Full Gear or World's End, start the new year with titles, and then you do something where, like these teams that feud in Blood and Guts actually show up there, and this time they don't have the extra bullshit involved, really. So it's ultimately about epilogue, really. So I think that, as I said, that ultimately Blood and Guts is a bailout for the women's division if it's booked very, very well. But it's definitely, as I said, that there's ways they could have made it way better if they had this on a pay-per-view. There's ways that they could have made it way better if, they went through with my strategy, like main eventing a pay-per-view with this, or even like doing something like experimenting with lesser matches, because they need to do that in AEW. Like sometimes the shows are way too long, and people are going to say, oh, well, it's like a Collision or a Dynamite, or more like a Collision, because many of the matches don't matter. You're throwing things together like, Big Bill and Eddie Kingston, really. So, that it's definitely, one of these things too, where, like I said, they did it wrong this year by not putting it on Wrestle Dream, or they did it wrong this year by saying instead of in St. Louis, we're gonna have Wrestle Dream in Greensboro, and then we're also gonna throw in the Blood and Guts match on that show, really. So that way we're in a 22,000 seat arena. We have Blood and Guts, the first women's Blood and Guts, and we have all this really great stuff, really, So hopefully they learn from this, and hopefully we get to a point where they say Blood and Guts is a pay-per-view match, really, because that's one of the reasons why it's hurting, really. And like I said before, and I'll say it again, you do not have the Hell in the Cell, and you do not have the Elimination Chamber only on Monday Night Raw, or you don't have War Games, which I believe got popular, and it was in WCW, but when it came over to WWE, they were doing a lot of it, and they were doing a lot of it on NXT pay-per-views. But imagine if they had War Games, TNA Wrestling, and NXT on. They said instead of Bound for Glory, or instead of a November show, November pay-per-view for NXT, they said, oh, we're going to do this on a weekly television, really. And they always did on weekly television. That makes no sense, really. Or imagine that they did the Survivor Series and they said, hey, we're going to do Survivor Series, the Survivor Series match or the War Game Survivor Series on Monday Night Raw, really. Doesn't make sense, really. So I just do hope that, eventually it is a pay-per-view match and they ultimately just get back to that, really. So it's definitely unfortunate that they're not doing that. They're too stubborn to do that. I think they want to keep tradition alive, or they maybe like, we're worried about ratings, so we want to do this. But in the end of the day, it's good that they're doing this. A lot of people wanted to see this, but the time and place is wrong. But hopefully, and hopefully they understand that the biggest part of this is 10 women go in. What do you do with them the next year when you go to Wembley Stadium, a 90,000 seat arena? Do you just use this to build your women's division and you build good, compelling characters and matches? You have conversations with these women about their lives and say, hey, we can turn this thing, that struggle into a storyline. Hey, we can turn this, match where you kicked ass and took names, or where you felt like you didn't do your best, or you felt like, or a champion's looking at you and saying, hey, you can be something someday, we're going to have a match or whatever. So there's a lot that that they can do to make a good epilogue. There's a lot they can do to turn this into a booster shot for the women's division. It comes down to what they're doing. And if they don't do that, then this is just a fuck all match, really. Just to have it for the fuck of it. It really needs to be a booster shot. 10 people that can help your women's division out over the next year, because they really need it. It cannot be just Mercedes, Tony Storm, and Athena holding things up.